She didn't cry when her stepmother handed her over like livestock. She didn't beg, didn't scream, didn't grab the doorframe and refuse to let go, even though every bone in her body was screaming at her to do exactly that. 19 years old, standing in frozen mud, watching the only roof she'd ever known disappear behind a stranger's wagon. Traded, not for gold, not for land, for flour, salt pork, and a promise of seed come spring. If you've ever been thrown away by the people who were supposed to love you, stay with me. This story is for you. Like this video, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this story travels. The wagon smelled like pine resin and old blood. Maeve noticed that first, before she noticed the man holding the reins, before she noticed the sky going gray at the edges the way it did when serious weather was building. She climbed into the back because there was nowhere else to go, wedged herself between a coil of rope and two empty grain sacks, and kept her eyes forward. She would not look back at the house. She absolutely would not. She looked back. Her stepmother, Dora, was already walking toward the front door, didn't pause, didn't turn around. The transaction was complete, and Dora Ashcroft moved on from completed transactions the way other people moved on from meals, efficiently, without sentiment, already thinking about the next thing. The man on the wagon seat, Gideon Voss, Dora had called him, said it the way you'd say the name of someone you didn't particularly respect, clicked his tongue at the horses, and they lurched forward. The wheels caught in frozen ruts, and the whole wagon shuddered, and Maeve grabbed the rope coil to keep from sliding. Nobody spoke. That was fine with her. She wasn't sure she trusted her voice anyway. It had happened fast, the way disasters usually do. 3 weeks ago, the harvest had been worse than bad. It had been catastrophic. The potato crop came up black. Half the winter wheat rotted in the field after 2 weeks of unseasonable rain, followed by an early frost that killed everything standing. The root cellar that should have been full to the ceiling by October held maybe 6 weeks of provisions if they stretched it and didn't have company. They had company. Dora's brother arrived from Knoxville in late October with his wife and 4 children, and suddenly the 6 weeks became 3, and the 3 became less than that because the brother ate like he was making up for lost time, and his children were bottomless pits in wool coats. Maeve had watched the stores dwindle and felt the particular helplessness of someone who can see the wall coming but can't stop the wagon. She'd tried. She'd cut her own portions in half, then in half again. She'd gone out in weather that had no business being walked in and set snares, checked them every morning with fingers she couldn't feel by the time she got back. She'd caught 3 rabbits in 2 weeks, which was something, but not enough. It wasn't enough. One morning, a Tuesday, gray and iron cold, Dora had called her into the kitchen and told her to sit down. Dora wasn't a cruel woman, exactly. She was a practical one, which Maeve had learned was sometimes worse. She had married Maeve's father 6 years ago when Maeve was 13, and she had never been unkind so much as she had been consistently, deliberately indifferent. Maeve was the daughter of the previous wife, a prior arrangement. Dora had her own children, 2 boys, 7 and 9, and they were hers in a way Maeve was never going to be. "I've made arrangements," Dora said, sitting across the kitchen table with her hands folded in front of her like she was about to discuss a recipe. "There's a man, trapper, lives up on Voss Ridge, who came through Carver's Mill last week looking for help. Seasonal labor, someone to get him through the winter." Maeve stared at her. "He's offering 3 months' worth of flour, cornmeal, salt pork, and 20 pounds of dried beans," Dora continued, "plus seed for spring. Good seed, not the cheap stuff. That's enough to see us through to harvest." "You're selling me," Maeve said. The words came out very flat, which surprised her. "I'm making an arrangement that benefits this family." "That's the same thing." Dora looked at her with those pale, patient eyes. "You're not a child, Maeve. You're 19. You're capable of hard work. Lord knows you've done enough of it here. This man needs someone who can handle a hard winter. He'll house you, feed you, and return you in spring. Return you, like a borrowed tool." "And if I refuse?" Dora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your brothers need to eat." She'd called them Maeve's brothers. First time in 6 years. "Tut." The man, Gideon, didn't speak for the first hour of the ride. The road out of Carver's Mill climbed steadily, the bare trees on either side pressing in close, and Maeve sat in the back and catalogued what she knew about him, which was almost nothing. He was older than she'd expected. Maybe 35, maybe older. It was hard to tell with men who spent their lives outside. He had the kind of weathered face that could be 40 or 50 depending on the light. Dark hair gone gray at the temples. Broad shoulders hunched slightly forward. He held the reins with both hands, and there was something deliberate about even that small motion, like he was concentrating on it. When they hit a steep section of the road and the horses struggled, he spoke to them in a low voice. Not commands, something more like conversation. She couldn't make out the words. His left leg was stretched out at an angle that wasn't quite right. She'd noticed it when he loaded the supplies onto Dora's porch. The way he carried himself. The careful placement of each step. Not quite a limp, more like a constant negotiation his body was having with itself. "You can sit up here if you want," he said suddenly, without turning around. "Back there's not comfortable." She thought about it. "I'm fine." He didn't push it. Another half-mile passed. The road narrowed to a track, and the track started to switch back up the mountain face, and the temperature dropped 3 degrees in what felt like 10 minutes. "How long is the ride?" she finally asked. 4 hours? Little more if the weather turns?" She looked at the sky. The gray was getting heavier, the clouds compressing themselves into something purposeful. "Is it going to turn?" "Probably." She waited for more. He didn't offer any. "What kind of trapper are you?" she asked, because silence was making her think too much, and thinking too much right now felt dangerous. He seemed to consider the question more carefully than it warranted. "The kind that's still alive," he said, "which is the only kind worth being." The snow started an hour later. Not serious snow. Not yet. Just a spitting, testing kind of snow that dusted the horses' backs and turned the wagon track white. Maeve pulled her coat tighter. It wasn't a good coat. She'd known this in a general way all winter, but she was knowing it more specifically now, with the wind coming off the mountain ridge and finding every place where the wool had worn thin. "There's a blanket," Gideon said, "under the seat. Reach around the left side." She hesitated. That meant leaning past him, reaching into his space. "I'm not going to bite you," he said. There was no offense in it, just a statement of fact. She reached around and found the blanket. It was heavy canvas on the outside, wool on the inside, and it smelled like wood smoke and something else she couldn't name. She wrapped it around her shoulders and was immediately, embarrassingly grateful. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. She sat with her legs dangling off the side of the wagon seat. She'd moved up front somewhere in the previous exchange without quite deciding to, and watched the mountain come closer. It was bigger than she'd realized from below. The ridgeline was hidden in cloud. "You live up there," she said. Not a question. 10 years, he said. "Alone?" A pause. "Until today." She didn't know what to do with that, so she left it there. The homestead appeared out of the snow and the tree line like something that had grown there rather than been built. A cabin, solid and low, with walls that had darkened to the color of the mountain itself. A barn to the left, newer looking than the house. Sheds and outbuildings scattered in a rough semicircle, each one positioned with some logic she'd have to learn. A woodpile that ran the entire length of the cabin's east wall, stacked so precisely it looked like brickwork. Gideon brought the horses around the barn and climbed down from the wagon with that careful, deliberate movement she'd clocked before. Up close, she could see the brace on his left leg, leather and iron, strapped above and below the knee. It allowed him to walk, but just barely. Every step cost him something. She jumped down from the other side before he could think about helping her, which would have been awkward for both of them. "Horses first," he said, "then I'll show you inside." She didn't wait to be told what to do in the barn. She unhitched the nearer horse, a big gray roan with a patient old eye, and started walking her toward the stall. She'd grown up working. At least that was something. Gideon said nothing, but she caught the way he watched her. Not suspicious exactly, more like recalculating. They worked in silence, moving around each other in the small barn space with the kind of careful distance of two people who don't know each other's rhythms yet. He forked hay. She found the water bucket and filled it from the pump outside, which took 2 tries to get working because the handle was stiff and her hands were already half frozen. When the horses were settled, he said, "Come inside." The cabin was one large room. She stood in the doorway and took inventory the way her father had taught her. What's here? What's missing? What do you need to know? A fireplace on the far wall, substantial, with an iron crane for cooking. A plank table, 2 chairs. A bed in the far corner, built into the wall. Shelves along every available surface, organized with a neatness that was almost obsessive. Dried herbs, sealed crocks, tools hanging on specific nails, books stacked spine out in strict order. And a second sleeping area. A loft accessed by a ladder, with a straw-stuffed mattress visible over the edge. She noticed it immediately and felt something in her chest loosen slightly, one specific knot among many. Gideon went to the fireplace and started building up the fire from the banked coals, moving with the efficiency of long habit. She watched his hands. They were steady, sure. Whatever the leg had cost him, his hands still worked. "Loft's yours," he said without looking up. "I don't do ladders." "Okay," she said. "There are rules." She stiffened. "All right." He sat back on his heels and finally looked at her directly, and she made herself hold the eye contact even though everything in her wanted to look away. His eyes were gray-green and they were older than the rest of him. They had seen things in them, packed down. "You work," he said. "You work hard, the same as me, or harder when I can't. You don't steal from me and I don't steal from you. If something's wrong, you say so. I'm not a patient man, but I'm a fair one. You stay out of my business unless it becomes your business, and I'll give you the same." She waited. "That's all," he said. "That's all the rules? How many did you need?" She thought about Dora's house, where the rules had been atmospheric, felt everywhere, stated nowhere. Impossible to follow because they kept changing. "Those are fine," she said. He turned back to the fire. "There's dried venison in the crock on the second shelf, cornbread from yesterday in the tin. Eat." "What about you?" "I ate before I went for the supplies." She found the food where he said it would be and ate standing at the table, too tired and too wound up to sit properly. The venison was tough and well seasoned, and the cornbread was better than anything Dora had made in a year. She ate all of it and felt guilty about eating all of it, and then thought about the snares she'd run for 3 weeks on half rations, and stopped feeling guilty. Gideon had settled into one of the chairs by the fire with a piece of leather harness and a needle, mending in the firelight. He didn't look at her. She got the sense that this was deliberate, that he was giving her space to exist without being watched. She climbed the ladder to the loft. The mattress crinkled under her weight, straw shifting. There was a quilt, old, patched, made by hands she'd never know. She pulled it over herself and lay in the dark and listened to the fire below and the snow against the shutters outside and tried to understand what her life had just become. She was on a mountain with a stranger. Her family had sold her for flour. Winter was closing in around the ridge like a fist. She waited to cry. Sometimes she got ahead of crying, caught it before it started if she was tired enough. Tonight, she was tired enough. She lay there with her eyes open in the dark and listened to the quiet sounds of a man she didn't know, living his quiet life below her, and she thought about her father, dead 3 years now, and she thought about the way Dora hadn't looked back. She thought, I am not going to be broken by this. She thought it very deliberately, the way you say something out loud so you can hear whether it's true. Then she closed her eyes, and for the first time in weeks, she slept without waking up hungry. Morning came blue and brutal. The fire had burned low in the night, and the cabin was cold enough that her breath fogged. She could hear Gideon already moving around below, the controlled sounds of someone who had learned to be quiet out of necessity. She climbed down the ladder. He was at the fireplace, his back to her, and he didn't turn around when she appeared, just said, "There's water heating, woodpile's low, after breakfast." She looked out the small window beside the door. The snow had stopped, but it had left behind a world that was sharp and merciless and white in every direction, and the sky was the color of a bruise healing. She pulled her coat on, found her boots, put them on while standing because the floor was cold enough to feel through her wool socks. "How low?" she asked. "Not low enough to worry about today, low enough to work on today." "Show me where the axe is," she said. He turned then, and there was something in his face she couldn't quite read. Not surprise exactly, more like a theory being confirmed. "Shed, east side," he said. "The big-handled one. Don't use the short one." "Why not?" "Because I like that one and you'll nick it." She almost smiled. She didn't, but it was close. She went out into the cold. The axe was where he said it was. Heavy and well-maintained, blade sharp enough to shave with. She picked it up, tested the weight, found the balance. She'd split wood since she was 12. Her father had shown her, the same summer he'd shown her how to set a fence post and how to read weather in the cloud formations, and how to properly sharpen a knife. She set the first log on the splitting block and looked at it. Then she swung. The log came apart clean. She set another. The mountain was quiet around her, that particular frozen silence that isn't empty so much as waiting. Somewhere far off, a bird called once and stopped. The cold reached into her lungs with every breath, the kind of cold that reminds you the body is warm and everything outside it is not. She swung again. She didn't know yet what this mountain would ask of her. She didn't know that the axe would become as familiar as a hand, or that she would learn to read the sky the way she'd learned to read faces, or that this man she was afraid of would teach her things about herself she hadn't known were there. She didn't know any of that yet, but she was swinging. And on this mountain, in this cold, in this life that had been handed to her without her consent, that was going to have to be enough. The first week nearly broke her, not in the way she'd feared, but not the way she'd lain awake in the loft those first nights imagining it might. Gideon Voss didn't raise his hand to her. He didn't speak to her with contempt or treat her like something he'd purchased and could therefore use however he pleased. What broke her, or came close to it, was simpler and more honest than that. The work. She'd thought she knew hard work. She'd been doing it her whole life, cooking, hauling water, tending animals, splitting wood when her brothers were too small to help, and Dora's hands were busy with other things. She'd thought of herself privately as someone who could handle whatever was put in front of her. The mountain disagreed. The first morning she'd split wood for 2 hours and felt capable, almost proud of herself, until Gideon came out and looked at the pile and said, without cruelty, "That's about a third of what we need each day." She'd stood there with her hands aching and her shoulders burning and tried to do the arithmetic and couldn't make it come out to anything she wanted to look at. She went back to the splitting block and kept going. The axe handle rubbed blisters on the inside of her right thumb and the base of her left palm. By the third day both had torn open, and she wrapped them in strips cut from the hem of her underlinen and kept going because she was not going to be the person who stopped because her hands hurt. By the end of the first week, the blisters had started to callous over, and her swing had changed, gotten more efficient without her noticing, and she was hitting the daily number without working until dark. Small victories. She collected them like stones. Gideon taught her things in the way of a man who didn't enjoy explaining himself, by demonstrating once, clearly, and then moving on with the assumption that she'd either gotten it or she'd ask. He showed her how to properly bank the fire so it held heat through the night without burning through the wood too fast. He showed her how to check the snare lines. He had 14 of them running out from the homestead in 3 directions, and how to reset them correctly when an animal had sprung the mechanism without getting caught, which happened more often than she would have guessed. He showed her how to read the weather off the ridgeline. See that cap cloud sitting right on the peak? He was standing beside her in the yard one morning, breath coming white. That means wind up high. When it starts dropping, pulling down the north face, get yourself inside within the hour. And if I'm out on the trap line, then you come in faster than an hour. She looked at the cloud. It was sitting still right now, just resting on the ridge like a hat. How much warning do you usually get? Enough, he said. If you're paying attention. He turned and went back to whatever he'd been doing, and she stood there for another minute watching the cloud, learning its shape so she'd know when it started to change. That was how most of their exchanges went. Practical, compressed, stripped of everything that wasn't necessary. She'd been braced for something else, for the particular ugliness that could exist between a man who held power and a woman who didn't, and its absence had created a strange kind of unease, like waiting for a sound that never came. One evening, about 10 days in, she was repairing a tear in her second-best coat by firelight while Gideon worked on something at the table, sharpening a skinning knife with a slow, rhythmic stroke of the whetstone. The fire was loud, and the wind outside was doing something complicated, and the silence between them was not exactly comfortable, but was becoming familiar, which was its own thing. "Why did you need someone?" she asked. He didn't stop with the whetstone. "I told you. Winter labor." "No, I mean—" She chose her words carefully because she'd learned he responded poorly to imprecision. "You've been up here 10 years. You managed before." The whetstone paused. "My leg was worse last winter than it's been," he said finally. "Had a bad fall in October, early ice on the North Trail. Spent 2 weeks mostly down. Nearly didn't make it to February." He resumed the sharpening. "I ran out of wood in January. Had to burn furniture." She looked at the table. The 2 chairs. Tried to imagine the calculation of looking at your furniture and deciding which piece you could afford to lose. "So it wasn't—" She stopped. "Wasn't what?" She'd been going to say it wasn't about owning someone, and she felt ridiculous about how much she'd needed to know that. "Nothing," she said. He looked at her across the firelight. His expression was unreadable most of the time, but she was starting to learn the small gradations. The way a particular set of his jaw meant he was in more pain than he was acknowledging. The way his eyes sharpened when he was actually interested in something versus just watching it. Right now he was reading her with those sharp eyes, and she felt her face go warm. "It wasn't about owning someone," he said quietly, like he was just stating a fact about weather. In case that was the question, she looked back at her sewing. "I know," she said. And then, because it was true, "I'm starting to know." He made a small sound that might have been acknowledgement and went back to the knife. Outside, the wind shifted, and somewhere up on the ridge, something cracked. A tree giving way, the sound of it rolling down through the mountain like a sentence being finished. The days stacked up into weeks, and Maeve stopped counting them, which was its own kind of milestone. She fell into the rhythms of the place, up before full light, fire built up, water heated, horses tended, then whatever the day required, and the day always required something. There was no shortage of work. The mountain produced it endlessly, the way it produced cold and wind, and the particular silence that existed above tree line. Firewood, hunting, checking and resetting the trap lines, repairing things that broke under the stress of constant use. A harness buckle, a hinge on the barn door, a crack in the clay chinking between 2 of the cabin's logs that let cold air in when the wind came from the northwest. Gideon repaired the chinking himself, mixing a new batch in a tin can with the practiced hands of someone who'd done it many times. She watched him work from a few feet away, not offering to help because he hadn't asked, and she was learning the difference between helping and hovering. "You want to know how to do this," he said. Not a question. "Yes," she said. He moved aside and handed her the stick he'd been using to work the mixture. Same consistency as thick biscuit dough. Push it in, smooth it back. Don't rush the smoothing. What for? Her first application was lumpy. She pressed it again, slower. "Better," he said, which, from him, was considerable praise. She started keeping a running list in her head of things she'd learned since the mountain. She'd always done this as a child. Cataloged knowledge the way other children collected objects, because she'd understood young that what you knew was the one thing that couldn't be taken from you. The list on the mountain grew longer every week. She added to it in the loft at night, going over the day's lessons the way she'd once reviewed sums before sleep. How to properly skin and dress a rabbit without wasting meat. How to set a stone weight on a trigger so it caught cleanly. How to judge ice thickness on the creek by the sound of it underfoot. How to move through deep snow without exhausting yourself inside of a quarter mile. The difference between the tracks of a healthy deer and one that was favoring a leg. Which trees burned longest, which burned hottest, which burned with a particular scent that meant you shouldn't burn them inside. She was becoming someone new, and she was doing it one bruised hand and one aching muscle at a time, and she didn't have the right words for how that felt, but it felt like something. Gideon was harder to read than the mountain, which was saying something. He was not unkind, but he'd built walls in himself the same way he'd built the walls of this cabin, methodically, with materials chosen for durability rather than appearance, with no decorative features that might create weakness. He lived close to the surface of necessary things and kept everything else packed down somewhere she couldn't see. She caught glimpses sometimes. The way he handled the horses, with a gentleness that was almost at odds with everything else about him, talking to them in that low, constant voice, his hands soft on their noses. The books on the shelf, which she'd started to notice more carefully. There were novels among the technical manuals, worn paperback spines with titles she recognized, authors she'd read herself, which surprised her and then made her feel slightly embarrassed about being surprised. The way he sometimes stood outside in the early morning in the cold and just looked at the view from the ridge, valley far below, mountains layered blue and gray and white into the distance, with an expression on his face that was the closest thing to peace she'd ever seen him wear. She asked him about the leg one evening when they were both tired enough to have let the careful distance down slightly. She hadn't planned to ask. It came out the way things do when you stop managing what comes out of your mouth. What happened to it? He looked at her, long enough that she thought he was going to refuse to answer. Trapping accident, he said. 7 years ago. Caught myself in my own snare. He said it flat, matter of fact, but there was something underneath it that was neither. Took 3 days for the leg to be found. Infection got into the bone by the time the doctor in the valley saw it. She absorbed this. 3 days. In the cold, alone, in a trap of his own making. They wanted to take it, he said. The leg. I wouldn't let them. Why not? He was quiet for a moment. Because I wasn't done with it yet. She looked at him, Bucky. Really looked at him, the way she hadn't let herself do in the early weeks when looking felt like a vulnerability. The brace on his leg was visible below his trouser cuff, the leather darkened with years of wear. She thought about what it cost him every day to navigate this homestead on that leg, the woodpile, the barn, the trap lines, all of it. And she thought about a man lying in the snow for 3 days with his leg in a trap and deciding he was not done yet. That must have been very cold, she said, which was not what she meant at all, but it was what came out. Something shifted in his face. For just a second, something that was almost a smile. Yes, he said. It was very cold. She went back to her work. After a moment, so did he. It was 2 days before the blizzard that she understood she'd stopped being afraid of him. She didn't notice it happening. There was no particular moment she could point to. It was more like noticing one morning that you hadn't thought about something you'd been thinking about constantly, the way grief can ebb sometimes without your permission. She went through a whole day without bracing when he came through a door, without tracking his position in the room, without the low-level vigilance she'd been maintaining since she'd climbed into his wagon. And at the end of that day, she sat in the chair by the fire and looked at the back of his head where he was bent over the table and thought, I trust this person. It scared her more than the fear had. The morning before the blizzard, Gideon came in from checking the south trap line, and he was moving differently. She clocked it before she identified it. Something was wrong with the usual negotiation his body ran, the careful positioning around the bad leg. He set down the 3 rabbits he was carrying and stood very still for a moment, and she saw his jaw working. What happened? She said. Nothing. Your leg is fine. It was not fine. She could see it was not fine. He crossed to his chair with the particular controlled care of a man moving through pain he won't acknowledge, and she watched him lower himself into it and saw the lines around his eyes go white at the edges. The South Trail has ice, he said. Want you to check it before you use it. There's a section on the switchback. Gideon. He stopped. Is the brace damaged? A pause. The upper strap pulled the buckle ring. It's just... Let me see it. He looked at her for a long moment, and she held the look steadily. And eventually he reached down and began unbuckling the brace, moving slowly. She crossed the room and knelt beside the chair without making a production of it. The brace was iron and leather, built by someone who knew what they were doing, but 7 years of hard use showed in it. The leather creased and darkened, 2 of the rivets replaced at some point with different metal, and now the upper strap where it connected to the main frame was pulling away from the iron ring, the leather cracked through at the stress point. His leg beneath it was its own story. The bone had healed wrong and been rebroken and reset. She could see where the calf sat differently than it should. The muscle patterns distorted around old damage. There was a bruise developing where the failed strap had been torquing against the skin. I can fix the strap, she said. I need heavy thread and an awl, and beeswax if you have it. Shelf above the door, leather kit in a tin box. She got the tin, came back, and got to work. She'd mended harness leather before, watched her father do it dozens of times, and leather was leather when it came to the technique. She cleaned the cracked area first, worked beeswax into it, let it sit while she threaded the awl and prepared the stitching. He was watching her work, not uncomfortably, just watching. "You know what you're doing," he said. "My father," she said. She didn't elaborate, and he didn't push. She stitched the leather back onto the ring with a double pass, pulled each stitch tight, sealed the outside with another layer of wax rubbed in hard. It wasn't a permanent fix. The leather at that point was compromised and would need replacing when they could get to town, but it would hold. "Put your weight on it slow," she said when she'd buckled it back on. He stood, and she watched him test it, that constant internal negotiation his body ran, becoming something more careful, more attended to. The repair held. He looked down at her. She was still kneeling on the floor and hadn't stood yet, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "Thank you," he said. And he meant it in that particular way of people who don't say thank you easily, which made it worth more. She stood and put the tin back on the shelf and went to start on dinner and didn't say anything else about it, because there wasn't anything else to say, and she was learning that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a person is let them keep their dignity intact. That night, the temperature dropped 20 degrees in 4 hours. Maeve woke in the loft to a sound she hadn't heard before. A deep, resonant pressure against the north wall of the cabin, like the mountain itself was leaning in. The shutters were straining in their frames. She lay in the dark and listened and felt something cold move through her that wasn't the air. She climbed down the ladder. Gideon was already at the fireplace, building the fire up high and fast, and the look on his face when she appeared told her everything she needed to know before he said a word. "It's here," he said. She looked at the door, the gap along the bottom where thin light would show in daytime, and what was coming through it now was something that had no color. Just cold. Just pressure. Just the mountain reminding them of the terms. "What do we need?" she asked. "Everything inside that isn't already," he said. "And then we're staying in." She pulled on her coat and her boots and opened the door, and the blizzard hit her like a wall. And for a second she couldn't breathe, couldn't see, couldn't orient herself in any direction. She put her hand on the guide rope Gideon had strung between the cabin and the barn. She hadn't known what it was for until now, and followed it hand over hand through the white. She got the horses fed and watered and the barn door secured with its extra crossbar. She brought in the last of the firewood from the covered section of the porch. She checked every window latch and found one on the south side not fully caught and fixed it just as the wind tried to open it from outside. She came back inside with ice in her hair and her coat plastered to one side where the wind had driven snow into every gap, and she found Gideon sitting in his chair by the fire, and something about the way he was sitting made her stomach drop before she understood what she was looking at. He was breathing wrong. Not labored, but careful. The way people breathe when breathing itself is costing something. "What happened?" she said, and heard her own voice come out sharp and afraid. "Got up to bank the far window," he said. "Slipped." She crossed the room fast. He hadn't fallen. He was in the chair, upright, but his face was the color of old ash, and the set of his jaw was the tightest she'd seen it, which was saying something because she'd seen him work through considerable pain without much expression. "Your leg?" "Hip," he said. "Hit the corner of the table. Don't say fine," she said. His mouth closed, opened again. "It's not the bone," he said. "I know what broken bone feels like. It's the muscle." She looked at him for a long moment, reading what she could read, and then she pulled the other chair around close and sat down across from him and said, "Then we stay in and we wait." He looked at the door, at the window, at the fire. "I won't be able to do much," he said, and it cost him to say it. She could hear that. "For a few days, maybe more." "I know," she said. "The trap lines." "I know the trap lines," she said. "I know all 14 of them." She did. She'd been running them with him for 2 weeks and then alone when he sent her. "I know the South Trail has ice on the switchback. I know the creek line runs north-northeast, and I reset the third snare from the east end last Tuesday because it had sunk into the mud." He stared at her. "I've been paying attention," she said. "That's what you told me to do." Something moved through his face that she couldn't name. Not gratitude, something older than that, and raw. Like a man who has been bracing against a wall for so long he's forgotten what it feels like when someone else takes some of the weight. Outside, the blizzard hit the north wall again, that deep resonant pressure, and the fire ducked sideways in the gust that found the chimney. Snow was audible now as a constant hiss against the shutters, against the roof, against everything. "Sleep," Maeve said, standing. "I'll take first watch on the fire." He didn't argue, which told her more about his pain than anything else had. She set herself in the chair with a piece of mending in her lap and tended the fire through the night while the blizzard did what blizzards do on mountains. It demonstrated, at length and without apology, exactly how small two people and their cabin really were against all of it. She didn't feel small. She felt, for the first time in a life that had sold her, essential. She fed the fire another log and listened to the storm, and listened to Gideon's breathing, even out in sleep, and she sat with the strange, complicated weight of it. This man, this mountain, this life she hadn't chosen and was beginning, against every expectation, to claim. The blizzard lasted 4 days. Maeve knew this because she marked them. A small scratch on the inside of the window frame with her thumbnail each morning when she checked the shutters. A habit she'd developed without thinking about it. The way you develop habits when the outside world becomes inaccessible and you need something to anchor yourself to. 4 scratches. 4 days of white noise and white walls, and the cabin shrinking down to its essential elements: fire, food, 2 people, and the particular intimacy of being completely dependent on both. Gideon ran a fever on the 2nd day. She found out the way you find out things about people who don't volunteer information. She noticed he wasn't eating, and she put her hand on his forehead without asking permission, and felt the heat radiating off him before she'd fully registered what she was doing. He didn't pull away. That told her how bad it was. "How long?" she asked. "Since last night," he said. "It'll pass." "I know it'll pass," she said. "That's not what I asked." He looked at her with those gray-green eyes gone slightly glassy with fever and said nothing, and she went to the shelf where he kept his medicinals. She'd catalogued those too, in the first week, the way she'd catalogued everything, and found the willow bark and the dried elderflower and made a tea that her father's second cousin had sworn by, which was not a medical credential but was the best she had. He drank it without complaint, which was also evidence of how bad it was, and she pulled his blanket up and added another log to the fire, and spent the rest of that day watching him the way she'd learned to watch the weather on the ridge, for changes, for the thing that meant you needed to move. "You don't have to stay down here," he said at some point in the afternoon. "I know," she said. "I'm not going to—" He stopped. Tried again. "I'm not your responsibility." She looked up from the harness buckle she was repairing. There was always something to repair, and studied him for a moment. "You need water every 2 hours," she said. "The fire needs feeding every 3. Your hip needs you to stay off it or that muscle's not going to heal right, and you know that. And you'll get up anyway the second I'm in the loft, so I'm not going to the loft." He was quiet. "Besides," she said, going back to the buckle, "I sleep better down here by the fire." Which was true, though it was not the only truth. He said nothing for a while. Then, "The tea is terrible." "Drink it anyway." "I am drinking it." "I know, I'm watching you." Another silence, and then something happened that she hadn't expected. He laughed, not loud, barely more than an exhale actually, but real, caught somewhere between amusement and resignation, and it changed his whole face for that second in a way that made him look younger and more breakable, and more like a person than the controlled, self-sufficient presence she'd been living alongside for weeks. She didn't comment on it. Some things you leave alone. The fever broke on the 3rd morning, and he slept most of that day, properly this time, without the restless half-consciousness of the previous night. Maeve banked the fire and went through the cabin inventory with methodical attention, counting what they had, calculating what they needed, running the mathematics of a winter that still had 2 months in it against the stores that needed to last. The numbers were workable, but they left no room for error. No room for a second blizzard that lasted longer. No room for a trap line that stopped producing. She added another scratch to the window frame on the 4th morning and found, when she pushed open the shutter, that the wind had stopped. The world outside was a physical object again. Solid, specific, white without being featureless. Snow on every surface, packed deep against the north wall of the cabin where the wind had driven it. The sky was a hard, clear blue that hurt to look at directly. And it was cold. The kind of cold that doesn't move or shift or negotiate, just sits there and means business. She got dressed and went out. The first breath outside felt like swallowing ice. The second one felt like living. She shoveled a path to the barn first, found the horses impatient but unharmed, fed and watered them with the stores Gideon kept in the barn itself for exactly this kind of extended lockdown. She checked the barn roof for snow load. He'd told her the signs, the way the ridge beam would look under too much weight, and decided it was fine, or close enough to fine. Then she did the trap lines, all 14 of them, alone, in snow that in some places came above her knees. She'd done sections of them alone before, but never all of them in a single run, and never in post-blizzard conditions where every familiar landmark was buried, and the trail markers Gideon had put up, small, notched sticks at eye level, were the only thing distinguishing trail from not trail. She was gone 4 hours. She came back with 2 rabbits, a marten, and the particular satisfaction of a person who has done something they weren't sure they could do. Gideon was sitting up when she came in, the fever gone and replaced by a washed-out exhaustion that was at least the honest kind. He looked at what she carried and didn't say anything for a moment. "All 14?" he asked. "All 14. The 8th snare on the east line was buried. I dug it out and reset it. The creek line is iced over above the split, the way you said it would be. I reset those 3 higher like you showed me with the false flat." He nodded slowly. "You're limping worse than yesterday," she said. "It's better than yesterday." "It's worse. Sit." He sat, because they had arrived at a point where he would, and she went to the shelf for the liniment he kept there, and came back and he submitted to her checking the hip without making it into a negotiation. The bruise had developed into something spectacular, deep purple edged with green, spreading across his hip and down his thigh. The muscle beneath was tight and hot to the touch. "You need to stay off this for at least 3 more days," she said. "I can't stay off it for 3 more days." "You're going to, though." He looked at her with an expression that was equal parts annoyance and something she was starting to recognize as respect, which on his face looked nearly identical. "The trap lines need—" "I did the trap lines," she said. "I'll do them again tomorrow." She sat back and put the cap on the liniment and looked at him directly. "I've got this. Let your hip heal." Something shifted in him. She felt it more than saw it, a giving way, not defeat, but more like a person finally putting down something heavy they'd been carrying for a very long time. "All right," he said. She nodded and went to skin the rabbits. She did the trap lines the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. She learned the east line so well she could have run it with her eyes closed, which was almost literally true on the morning a fog came in and reduced visibility to about 15 feet. She learned to tell a marten track from a weasel track and a fox track from a coyote track by the spacing and the depth, and she learned which snare positions produced consistently and which ones she should think about moving in the next decent weather. She came home each day and told Gideon what she'd seen, and he listened and sometimes added something, and sometimes just listened, and it was in those evenings that they built, slowly and without ceremony, the thing they were building. She told him about her father on one of those evenings, not because she'd planned to. She almost never planned what she told him, she'd noticed. Things came out in the particular quiet of the post-dinner firelight when the day was finished and both of them were too tired to maintain the usual careful management of what they said. "He died when I was 16, she said. "Pneumonia. It was fast." Gideon was leaning back in his chair with the bad legs stretched out in front of him, and he turned his head slightly to show he was listening but didn't turn all the way, which she'd come to understand was how he gave people room to talk. "After that it was just Dora," she said, "and her boys. And I was just—" She looked at the fire. "I was just the other one, the leftover from before." "You kept working," Gideon said. "I kept working," she agreed, "because what else was there?" He was quiet for a moment. "That's not nothing," he said. "Showing up when there's no reward in it. Most people can't." She glanced at him. "Did you know that about me? When you made the arrangement with Dora?" He thought about it, which she appreciated. He didn't give her a reassuring answer faster than a real answer would have come. I didn't know you at all, he said. I knew that she had a girl who'd been working her farm all fall, and I was... He stopped. I was in a bad place after last winter. I needed help, and I didn't... He paused again. I didn't think it through as carefully as I should have. She absorbed that. That's an honest answer. Seemed like what the situation warranted. She looked at the fire. Were you afraid I'd be terrible at it? A pause. Were you afraid I'd be terrible to you? Yes, she said. Fair, he said. The fire said something in the language of fire, a pop and a shift, and the log settled into a new arrangement. I was afraid you'd run the first week, he said. First 3 days, actually. I kept expecting to wake up and find you gone. She thought about those first days, the blisters and the aching shoulders, and the arithmetic of the woodpile that hadn't added up. I thought about it, she said. What stopped you? She considered. The mountain, she said finally, which was true in a way she couldn't fully explain. I kept thinking, if I left, the mountain wins. And I didn't want the mountain to win. He made that sound again, the one that wasn't quite a laugh, but was related to it. That's exactly the right way to think about it, he said. It was 3 days after that conversation. Gideon up and moving again, the hip improved enough that he was doing shorter runs on the west trap line. When Maeve went alone to check the food cache in the secondary storage shed, the one half buried into the hillside on the north side of the homestead, dug into the earth for insulation the way root cellars were dug. She'd been there a dozen times. She knew the path. She didn't know the wolf. There were 2 of them, actually. She saw that a half second after she saw the first one, which was standing between her and the shed door with its head low and its yellow eyes fixed on her with an intensity that was nothing like the way dogs looked at people. Dogs looked at you as a variable. Wolves looked at you as a fact. The second one was to her left, maybe 30 feet, moving slowly through the snow with that awful patience of a predator that has calculated the situation and found it acceptable. She had the rifle. She always had the rifle now. Gideon had made her understand this in the second week, the way he'd made her understand the guide rope and the weather signs. A simple operational fact. You go outside the cabin, you take the rifle. She'd internalized it the way she'd internalized the other lessons, and right now she was very grateful she had. But she'd never shot at something that was looking at her like that. She'd shot rabbits. She'd fired at targets Gideon had set up on the south tree line, tin cans and a split log with a circle of charcoal on it. And she could group well enough at 40 feet, better than that if she had time to settle. He'd said she was a natural once, which had meant so much more than it should have. The wolf to her left was still moving. She brought the rifle up slowly. Everything in her wanted to move fast, to run, to yell, to do something loud and sudden that would make this stop. Everything Gideon had taught her said, slow, slow, and deliberate, and don't give anything a reason to make a decision before you've made yours. Stand your ground, he'd said once, about something else entirely, but it was what came to her now. Running tells them the story ends a certain way. Standing tells them they might have the math wrong. She planted her feet in the snow. The lead wolf was thin. That was the other thing she noticed, now that some part of her brain had stopped screaming long enough to observe. The visible ribs, the dull quality of the fur. These animals were not hunting from abundance. They were hunting from desperation, which meant they were less predictable and more dangerous, and also, some part of her registered this with something like sorrow, they were suffering. The one on her left stopped moving. Both wolves were looking at her now. She sighted on the lead wolf, not to kill it if she didn't have to, just to make a decision and commit to it. And she heard Gideon's voice in her head as clearly as if he were standing next to her. Don't point a gun at something you're not willing to shoot. The hesitation is what kills you. She was willing to shoot. She cocked the rifle. The sound cracked through the winter silence like a sentence being started. The lead wolf's ears went back. Its head tilted almost imperceptibly. She held the bead on its chest and breathed in and breathed out and did not move. 3 seconds that felt like a calendar. Then the lead wolf turned and walked away. Not a run, a deliberate walk, unhurried, dignity intact, the way a person leaves a room when they've decided to leave rather than been pushed out. The second wolf followed, moving parallel, and both of them disappeared into the tree line without looking back. She stood there for another minute with the rifle still up. Then she lowered it and found her hands shaking. She stood with the shaking in her hands and made herself breathe through it, because she'd earned the right to shake now that it was over, and there was nobody watching anyway. And she shook for about 30 seconds and then stopped and walked to the cache shed and did what she'd come to do. She was back at the cabin by mid-afternoon. Gideon was on the porch working on a section of harness, and he looked up when she came around the corner and read something in her face immediately. What happened? She told him, flatly, in order, the way he'd taught her to report things. What she saw, what she did, what the outcome was. She watched his face while she talked and watched the things that moved through it. Attention first, then a tightening around the eyes when she got to the two of them, then something that took her a moment to identify as relief. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You didn't run, he said. No. You held on both of them. Yes. He looked at her. Not the assessing look of the early weeks, not the careful calculation. Something else. Something that had been accumulating for a while and was now just visible on the surface where she could see it. Most people would have run, he said. I know, she said. I almost did. Almost doesn't count. She looked at him looking at her, and she felt something she didn't have a clean word for. Not pride exactly, because pride felt too small, and not happiness because happiness felt too simple. It was more like the feeling of a bone setting right, the feeling of a thing becoming what it actually was. The wolves were thin, she said. Really thin. He nodded. Hard winter all over. Not just us. She thought about that. The wolves moving through the same cold she moved through, hunting the same sparse animals from the same empty white expanse, hungry in the same way that hunger doesn't care what you are or what you deserve. Just hungry. Reason. And she leaned her back against the post and looked out at the tree line where the wolves had gone. I was scared, she said. I know, he said, but I wasn't. She thought about how to say it. It was like the fear was there, but it wasn't in charge. Like there was something else that had more say. He was quiet for a moment. Then, that's what it feels like when you've decided something, he said. Before, you're scared. After you've decided, you're just. He paused. You're just doing. She looked at him. He was looking at the tree line, not at her, his profile against the cold sky with the particular quality of someone who is saying something by the way they hold their face and is hoping you're paying enough attention to hear it. That's how you've been living up here, she said. Not a question. He didn't answer for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, for a long time, yes. She wanted to ask more. She didn't. There were things between them that were being built slowly, load-bearing things, and she'd learned that on the mountain you didn't put weight on a structure before the mortar had cured. What she knew was this. She had walked into a frozen forest alone and come out of it someone different than she'd gone in. She had stood her ground when every instinct said run. She had held steady in the way that mattered, and the mountain had registered it, not with reward or recognition because mountains don't work like that, but in the way that hard things survived, changed their shape inside you permanently. She was not the girl who had climbed into a stranger's wagon in frozen mud, sold for flour and seed. That girl was still in her somewhere, still the one who remembered what it felt like to be handed over like something that could be handed. She didn't think she'd ever stop being that girl entirely, but she was also this. Someone who had stood in snow with a rifle and made two wolves reconsider their options. That evening, Gideon made dinner for the first time since the blizzard. A stew from the dried venison and the last of the root vegetables, seasoned with herbs from the bundles on the shelf. He moved around the fireplace with his careful, deliberate motions, and she sat at the table and watched without offering to help, because she understood by now that cooking was something he needed to do on his own terms, the way she needed to do the trap lines on her own terms, and respecting that was part of the thing they were building. He set the bowl in front of her and sat across the table and picked up his spoon, and they ate together in the firelight with the cold outside, doing what it always did, pressing, testing, looking for ways in. It didn't find any. After dinner, he went to the shelf and took down one of the worn paperbacks. She'd read her way through 4 of them by now, with his quiet permission, and she took the one she was in the middle of, and they sat on opposite sides of the fire and read. And the cabin was full of the sounds of two people being alive in the same space without any of it being wrong. She did not think about Dora. She did not think about the mud and the wagon and the transaction that had put her here. She thought about wolves moving through the trees, thin and hungry, and still somehow regal in the way wild things are regal, even when they're struggling. She thought about the shape of a decision and what it feels like to be on the other side of one. Outside, the mountain was quiet for the first time in days. The stars were out, the kind of stars you only got at altitude, sharp and close, not decorative but structural, as if the sky needed them to hold itself up. She turned a page. Spring on the mountain didn't arrive so much as negotiate. It came in pieces. A week of thaw followed by 3 days of hard freeze, mud one morning and ice the next, the snow retreating up the hillsides in slow stages like something that didn't want to go. The creek unfroze and refroze and unfroze again. The horses got restless in the barn, which Gideon said was how he knew the real change was coming before any other sign showed it. Maeve learned to read spring the way she'd learned to read everything else up here, by watching what the mountain did and understanding that it operated on its own schedule and didn't care about hers. She had been on the ridge for 4 months. She knew this not because she was counting anymore, but because she knew it the way you know things that have become part of your body. The same way she knew where every snare sat on every line, where the ice was still treacherous on the south switchback, which board in the barn floor had the soft spot that would eventually need replacing, how long the fire needed to catch from cold before it could be left alone. She knew Gideon the same way now, the way his jaw set when the leg was bad but he wasn't going to say so, the way he went quiet before he said something that mattered rather than after, the way he drank his coffee standing at the window in the morning looking at the ridge, not because there was anything to look at, but because he needed those 60 seconds to himself before the day started. She'd stopped marking time the morning she'd realized she wasn't waiting for spring anymore. That realization had come with its own complicated weather, something she didn't examine too carefully because she'd learned that some things fall apart when you look at them directly. What she knew was simpler and sturdier than anything she could have named. This was her life now. Not the life she'd been handed, the one she'd built out of the materials available, like chinked log walls and repaired leather straps, imperfect and solid and hers. She was standing at the edge of the cleared yard on a morning in late March, watching a line of geese cross the valley far below, when Gideon came out onto the porch and said, "Someone's coming up the track." She turned. He was standing with his hand shielding his eyes, looking south toward the lower trail, and the expression on his face was the one she'd learned to pay attention to. Not quite alarm, but the preparatory version of it, the version that came before. She crossed the yard and stood beside him and looked. 3 horses on the lower trail. Too far to make out faces, but she could see the way they were dressed. Not working clothes. Town clothes. And behind the riders, a 4th figure on foot, having trouble with the mud on the trail and making no attempt to hide their irritation about it. Gideon was very still beside her. "Do you know them?" she asked. "The man in front?" he said. "Harlan Cade." He said the name the way you'd say the name of a weather pattern. Descriptive, deliberately free of the feeling behind it. "Who is he?" "He owns most of the timber operations in the valley. Has for 20 years. Gideon paused. "He's wanted this ridge for 12 of them." She looked at the riders picking their way up the track, unhurried, with the particular confidence of people who don't anticipate being turned away. The 4th figure, the one on foot, had gotten stuck in a mud patch and was working their boot free with considerable effort and no dignity. Something cold that had nothing to do with the temperature moved through her. "What does he want with the ridge?" she asked, though she already knew the shape of the answer. "Timber," Gideon said. "Old growth on the north face. He's been logging south of here for 3 years, and he's worked his way up to my property line." He shifted his weight. The careful readjustment she knew meant the leg was talking to him. "He sent men up twice before. I sent them back both times." "How?" He glanced at her. "Politely," he said. "The first time." She understood what that meant about the second time. The riders were close enough now that she could see faces. Harlan Cade was in front. A heavy man in his 50s, thick through the chest and jaw, with the kind of self-assurance that came from spending decades being the biggest thing in any room he entered. He wore a good coat and a bad expression, and he was looking at Gideon's homestead with the particular look of a man doing arithmetic. The two men behind him were not ranch hands. She could see that now. The way they sat their horses, the iron at their hips, deputies or hired guns or something in between, which, in her experience, amounted to the same thing. And the fourth figure, now free of the mud and moving again with small, furious steps, Maeve felt the air go out of her. Dora. Her stepmother was wearing her good dress under a traveling coat, and she was picking her way through the mud with the expression of someone who has made a calculation and is committed to seeing it through. She looked exactly the same as she always had, contained, pale-eyed, practical. And the sight of her hit Maeve somewhere she hadn't expected it to, somewhere she'd thought had sealed over. Gideon felt her go still beside him. "You know her," he said quietly. Not a question. "Yes," Maeve said. Her voice was steady, which surprised her. Cade pulled his horse up at the edge of the yard and looked down at them with the practiced ease of a man who spent a lot of time looking down at people. "Voss," he said. Not a greeting, just an identification. "Cade," Gideon said. Same tone. Cade's eyes moved to Maeve and over her in the way men like that looked at women. Not with any particular interest, just cataloging. "This the girl?" Dora had reached the edge of the yard now, breathing harder than she wanted to. She looked at Maeve and Maeve looked back at her, and the thing that passed between them was not warm. "Yes," Dora said. She directed this at Cade rather than at Maeve. "That's my stepdaughter." "I'm nobody's stepdaughter," Maeve said. Quietly. Clearly. Dora's eyes came back to her. "Maeve, what do you want here?" Gideon said. He hadn't moved from the porch step, and he wasn't going to, Maeve understood. He was establishing that this was his ground, and he was standing on it, and he was not going to cross the yard to meet them, which would have been the position of someone interested in negotiating. Cade shifted in his saddle. "I'll be direct. I've got an offer on this ridge. Good offer. More than the timber's worth, and you know it. Enough to set yourself up somewhere comfortable. Somewhere the leg doesn't have to fight the terrain every day." He said this last part the way he probably thought was a favor, pointing out the obvious disability, giving Gideon a respectable reason to accept. Gideon said nothing. "The girl's situation complicates things," Cade continued. "A deal with you is a deal with her too, legally speaking, which is a problem given that she's—" He glanced at Dora. "She's a runaway," Dora said, and her voice was as even as ever, as if she was reciting a grocery list. "She was contracted to Mr. Voss for winter labor. The contract is expired. She's legally bound to return home." She paused. "I've spoken with the county sheriff. He agrees." Silence. Maeve was aware of several things simultaneously. The rifle leaning against the porch post 18 inches to her left, the expression on the face of the man behind Cade's right shoulder who had the look of someone hoping things went complicated, and the particular stillness that had come over Gideon beside her. Not passive stillness, the other kind, the kind that came right before a decision. "She's not a runaway," Gideon said. Cade tilted his head. "The contract—" There was no contract. His voice was level and final. There was an arrangement made in desperation by a woman with too many mouths and not enough food. I've never treated it as binding, and I don't now. He looked at Dora. "You know what you did. Call it what you like." Dora's chin came up. "I provided for my children." "You sold mine," Maeve said. The word came out before she'd decided to say it, and she didn't know exactly what she meant by it, but it landed in the yard between them like a stone, and Dora went very still. Cade cleared his throat. "Be that as it may, legally." "She's my wife," Gideon said. Maeve looked at him. He was looking at Cade, and his expression hadn't changed. The same flat, clear-eyed, nothing-to-lose look he'd worn since the riders appeared on the trail. The words sat in the air. Cade blinked. "I was told—" "You were told what my neighbor chose to tell you," Gideon said, "which is her version. This is mine. Maeve Voss has lived on this ridge since November, and she's not going anywhere." One of the men behind Cade shifted, and the leather of his saddle creaked in the silence. "Voss," Cade said, and his voice had changed register. Still measured, but with something harder underneath it now. "I'm trying to make this simple. Take the money. Both of you go somewhere easier. This ridge is—" "Mine," Gideon said. "Clear deed, 10 years filed. You know that because you've checked. Timber rights don't always follow. I'm not interested in what they don't always do." Gideon came down off the porch step, and the movement was deliberate, and it cost him something, and he didn't show any of it. He walked to the edge of the yard with the careful, negotiated stride of a man who has made his leg carry him through things it didn't want to carry him through, and he stopped with about 15 feet between himself and Cade's horse. "I'm going to say this once, and I won't say it again. Take your offer and your hired men and this woman back down my trail. Don't come back." Cade looked at him for a long moment. Then his eyes moved to Maeve, calculating, and she felt what he was calculating. Whether she was actually a factor here or a complication that could be resolved by other means. She picked up the rifle. She didn't point it at anyone. She held it at rest across her body. Her right hand on the grip, barrel angled down, the way Gideon had shown her was the position of someone who wasn't making a threat, but wasn't pretending they didn't have an opinion. One of the hired men put his hand to his hip. "Don't," she said, and looked at him directly, and something in her voice or her face, or just the specific quality of the stillness she'd brought down off the mountain with her, made him stop. The yard was very quiet. Cade looked at the rifle, looked at Maeve's face, looked at Gideon standing in the mud with his bad leg and his arms loose at his sides, and the expression of a man who had spent 7 years alone on a mountain, learning the difference between things worth being afraid of and things that just thought they were. He looked at Dora. Dora was looking at Maeve with an expression that Maeve couldn't fully read. Something complicated, layered, not entirely without guilt. Though guilt in Dora never arrived clean, always mixed with justification, always already building its own defense. Their eyes held for a moment that stretched. Maeve thought about the kitchen table, Dora's folded hands. "I've made arrangements." She thought about watching the house go away behind the wagon and making herself not look back and then looking back anyway and seeing nothing. Not even Dora at the window, not even that. She'd thought the worst part was being sold. She understood now that the worst part had actually been the way it had confirmed something she'd suspected for 6 years, that she'd never really been there at all. But she was here now. "I want you to hear me say something," Maeve said, and she was speaking to Dora now, not Cade, not the hired men. "I know you did what you thought you had to. I know you were scared about the winter and the food and the boys." She kept her voice even. "I'm not interested in settling accounts. I'm interested in you understanding that this is done. Whatever claim you think you have on me is done. I'm not coming back. I'm not a resource you get to use when you're short." Dora's jaw tightened. "You have no legal—" "I have a rifle," Maeve said, "and the high ground, and a husband who knows every trail off this mountain, and I am standing on land we both earned." She paused. "Go home, Dora. Feed your boys. Leave me out of it." The silence after that had a particular texture. Not tense, something past tension, something that had resolved itself and was waiting for the people in it to catch up. Cade turned his horse. It was not a dramatic gesture, just a man making a business decision, recalculating his options, deciding the timber on the north face wasn't worth whatever this was going to cost. He was not a man who got his hands dirty himself, and the people he'd brought weren't getting paid enough for a standoff against 2 people who clearly had nothing to lose and a great deal they were willing to protect. "This isn't finished," he said, to the general air, rather than to either of them specifically. "Yes, it is," Gideon said. "Ride safe." Cade rode. His men followed. Dora stood for another moment in the mud of the yard, looking at Maeve with that complicated, layered expression, and Maeve looked back without flinching and without cruelty either, just honestly, the way you look at someone when you've finally accepted who they are and what they're capable of and decided it doesn't get to be your weight to carry anymore. Then Dora turned and followed the horses down the trail, moving carefully through the mud in her good dress, and Maeve watched her go until she couldn't see her anymore. Neither she nor Gideon moved for a moment after the sound of hooves faded. Then Gideon said, "I should have asked you first." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the trail, not at her. "The wife thing," he said. "I should have—" It was fast thinking, she said. It was presumptuous, he said, and he said it with the stiffness of a man who doesn't apologize easily, but has decided this requires it. She looked at him for a long moment, at the set of his jaw and the way his hands had gone into his coat pockets, and the particular quality of the vulnerability on his face, which was not something he wore well or often, and which meant considerably more because of that. It wasn't wrong, she said carefully. He looked at her then. I said it wasn't wrong, she repeated. It wasn't. She paused, searching for the right shape of the thing. It didn't feel like a lie when you said it, is what I mean. He held the look, and she held it back, and between them in the mud of the yard in the thin spring sunlight, something passed that was neither of them saying the thing directly, but both of them knowing what the thing was. The legal part, he said finally. We can sort the legal part, she said. He nodded slowly, looked back at the trail, which was empty now, the mud just mud again, nothing on it that didn't belong. Cade will try again, he said. Maybe not this season, but he's not a man who drops things. Neither am I, Maeve said. He made the sound that was almost a laugh. No, he said. You're definitely not. She leaned the rifle back against the porch post and stood beside him in the thin spring warmth, and they looked out over the valley below where the morning was spreading itself out at a distance, green and brown and patched with the last snow, beautiful in the particular way of things that are far enough away not to touch you. He'll get a lawyer, Gideon said. Let him. It could get complicated. Gideon, she said. He stopped. We held this mountain through a blizzard and a fever and 14 trap lines and 2 wolves, she said. I think we can handle a lawyer. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, When you put it that way, and she could hear in his voice the same thing she'd heard the night he'd told her she wasn't wrong, something that had been held tight for a very long time beginning, carefully, to let go. The valley below was waking up. The geese she'd watched earlier were long gone south, replaced by smaller birds, the kind that came back first when winter released, picking at the thawed edges of the creek she could just see catching light far below. Up here the ground was still half frozen, still more gray than green, still deciding. She thought about Cade's face when she'd picked up the rifle, the way his calculations had shifted. She'd seen that shift before, with the wolves, with the long nights of the blizzard, with everything the mountain had put in front of her and she'd refused to run from. The moment when something that thought it understood the situation had to reconsider its arithmetic. She thought about Dora walking down the trail in her good dress. The grief for that was still there. She didn't expect it to go away clean, the way grief about family never did, because the loss isn't only the person you're grieving, it's the family you thought you had, the one you kept hoping would be real. That loss didn't have a season. It would come back at odd moments, probably for years, and she'd deal with it when it did. But it was not going to live in her house. I need to check the east line, she said. The mud's bad in the lower section, Gideon said. I know. I'll come around through the creek crossing. He nodded. He'd started to say something else. She could tell by the small pause, the breath that preceded a thing he'd decided not to say yet. And she let it go because she'd learned the difference between things he was holding back and things he was just taking his time with. This was the second kind. She picked up the rifle and crossed the yard toward the tree line and heard him behind her, moving back toward the cabin, the familiar cadence of his walk that she knew now as well as her own. She was almost to the tree line when he said her name. She stopped and turned. He was standing by the porch, one hand on the post, and the morning light was doing something plain and honest to his face, showing the lines in it, the years, the way the bad leg had slightly changed the angle of his whole body, and he was looking at her with an expression she'd never quite seen on him before, open, in the way of something that has decided the exposure is worth the risk. When the pass is clear, he said, I'd like to make it official, if that's... He stopped, started again. If you want that. She looked at him across the mud yard in the thin spring light, this man she had been afraid of, and then not afraid of. This man who had taught her to read clouds and set snares and stand her ground, who had burned furniture to stay warm alone rather than ask for help, who had looked at her over a fireplace and said it wasn't about owning someone, like it was just a fact about weather, and trusted her to understand what it meant. She had not imagined, in the wagon on that first day, that she would end up here. She had not imagined most of what the winter had made her. You never did, she supposed. You just did the next thing in front of you and kept doing it, and somewhere in there you became someone you hadn't planned to be. Yes, she said, I want that. He nodded. Something settled in his face, something that had been braced without both of them knowing it. She turned back to the tree line and walked into it, the rifle easy in her hands, the trail familiar under her boots even in the mud, and behind her the homestead sat solid against the mountain that owned nothing and yet had made them both into what they were. Spring was negotiating its way up the ridge, slow and grudging and real. She walked into it with her eyes open. The lawyer arrived in April. Not Cade himself, said men like Cade didn't do their own dirty work in the second round, having learned from the first round that showing up personally had costs. He sent a man named Burrell, thin and precise in a coat that was too good for the mountain mud, carrying a leather satchel and a document that used a great many words to say a small number of things. Maeve read it at the kitchen table, while Gideon stood at the window with his coffee, and Burrell stood near the door looking like a man who wanted to be somewhere else. The document said, in its elaborate legal language, that Maeve Ashcroft, they used that name deliberately, she noted, not Voss, had been contracted to one Gideon Voss for seasonal labor under terms arranged by her legal guardian, Dora Ashcroft née Holloway, and that said contract had expired in February, and that her continued residence on the property constituted unlawful harboring of a dependent, and that furthermore the timber rights to the northern face of Voss Ridge were subject to a prior claim predating Gideon's deed by 3 years, a claim which Harlan Cade's company had recently acquired and intended to exercise. She set it down on the table. How much of this is real? She asked Burrell. He had the look of a man who'd been asked this question before and had learned not to answer it directly. The claim is filed, he said. The legal status of the labor arrangement is arguable, she said. He paused. Complicated, he said, by the fact that I'm his wife. Burrell looked at his satchel. There's no record of a marriage. The passes were closed all winter, she said. We're planning to formalize it once we can get to town. She looked at him steadily. Which we're doing, this week, in fact. Gideon turned from the window. She hadn't told him this specifically. They talked about it in the general way of something both intended, but she hadn't said this week before now. He looked at her across the room and she looked back, and they had one of those conversations that had no words in it, the kind they'd been having since January, the kind that got built out of 4 months of shared silence and shared labor, and learning each other in the way you learned the mountain, incrementally by necessity, until one day you just knew. He nodded. Slightly. Enough. Then I'd suggest you wait for the record, she told Burrell, before you file anything else that assumes otherwise. Burrell left the way men leave when they've accomplished neither what they came for nor what they hoped to avoid. With the document, since she'd declined to sign it, and with the air of someone composing a difficult report in his head as he walked. Gideon watched him go down the trail from the window, and when the man was out of sight, he said, You didn't have to do that. I know, Maeve said. The timber claim might be legitimate. We'd need to look at the original deed filings, find out what predates what. That's a courthouse trip, not a... Gideon, she said. He stopped. One thing at a time, she said. First the town, then the courthouse. He was quiet for a moment. You're sure, he said, and she understood he wasn't asking about the courthouse. She had thought about this. She'd thought about it in the clear-eyed way of someone who had stopped pretending that certainty was the same as safety. You were never certain, not completely, not about any of the things that actually mattered. Her father had been certain about the harvest the year it failed. Dora had been certain she was making a practical decision. The wolves in the snow had probably been certain, right up until they weren't. What she had was not certainty. It was something more honest than that. She had watched this man hold a homestead together on a broken leg for 10 years. She had watched him talk to horses and read books in firelight and teach her things about surviving without once making her feel small for not knowing them already. She had watched him stand in a mud yard and face down a land baron with nothing behind him but the deed in his house and the 18 years of his life he'd put into this mountain, and she had watched him not flinch. She had also watched him burn furniture to stay warm alone, rather than ask anyone for help, and carry pain for days without acknowledging it, and go quiet in ways that lasted too long. She knew those things too. "I'm sure," she said. "I'm not pretending it's going to be easy, but I'm sure." He set down his coffee cup and crossed the room, and he was still moving with that careful negotiation around the bad leg. But she'd stopped seeing it as a limitation a long time ago. It was just the way he moved, part of the architecture of him, the same as the gray in his hair and the way his eyes went sharp when something mattered. And he stopped in front of her and looked at her with that open expression she'd first seen the morning after Cade's visit, the one that still didn't sit easily on his face and meant more because of it. "All right," he said. She reached up and put her hand on his jaw, briefly, the way you touch something real to confirm it's there. He went very still under her hand, like a man who had been alone long enough that being touched still registered as something requiring adjustment. "All right," she said back. They rode down to town 3 days later. Carver's Mill had the specific quality of places that exist primarily as a service to the areas around them. Practical, not pretty, organized around function rather than charm. A mill, a general store, a post office that also served as the courthouse annex, 2 churches, a smithy, a tavern that opened at noon and closed when it felt like it. Maeve had not been here since the morning she'd left in Gideon's wagon. She felt the town from the outside before they rode into it, the particular compression of being among people after months of having only one, the noise that felt enormous but was probably ordinary, the sensation of being looked at which was strange after so long being looked at by no one but him. The justice of the peace was a woman in her 60s named Hargrove, who had the manner of someone who had performed enough marriages to have developed opinions about which ones would last. She looked at them across her desk. Gideon in the cleanest shirt he owned, which was still a working man's shirt. Maeve in the dress she'd had packed since November, and had never worn on the mountain because there'd been no occasion for a dress on the mountain. And she looked at them for a long moment before she opened the register. "You come down from Voss Ridge?" she said to Gideon. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Thought I recognized you." She looked at Maeve. "And you're the girl who wintered up there." "I'm the woman who wintered up there," Maeve said, not unkindly. Hargrove's mouth twitched. "Fair enough," she said, and opened the register. It was not a long ceremony. Hargrove read the words in the direct, undecorated way of someone who respected what the words meant and didn't feel they needed embellishment. Gideon said what he was supposed to say in his flat, clear voice, the same voice he used when he was saying something that mattered. Maeve said what she was supposed to say, and felt the words settle somewhere inside her like stones set in a foundation. Not dramatic, not transformative in the moment, just solid, the way the right things felt when they were right. Hargrove signed the register. Gideon signed it. Maeve signed it, and under the name Voss, her handwriting was slightly different than it had ever been. She noticed this without being sure why, just that the pen moved differently when you were writing something true. "Congratulations," Hargrove said, and she sounded like she meant it. They stayed in town long enough to handle the other business. The courthouse annex had records going back 40 years, and the clerk, a meticulous man named Fitch, who smelled like paper and took personal offense at disorganized filing, pulled the original Voss deed and the timber rights documentation, and spread them across a table with the reverence of a man presenting evidence. The prior claim Cade's lawyers had cited turned out to be attached to a parcel that shared a survey marker with the north face of Goss Ridge, a different ridge, 2 miles east, the marker having been mislabeled in an 1887 resurvey. The error was documented. The correction had been filed in 1901. Cade's people had either not looked carefully or had looked carefully and decided to try it anyway. Fitch made a certified copy of the correction with the air of someone who enjoyed seeing sloppy legal work fail, which Maeve respected. "If he files on this claim," Fitch said, tapping the copy, "this is what ends it." "How long would that take?" Gideon asked. Fitch considered. "County judge sits in June. If he files before May, June at the latest." Gideon looked at Maeve. She looked at the documents, the mistake and its correction, the evidence of 2 mountains nearly confused for each other, and then correctly distinguished, sitting in a file for 20 years, waiting for the moment when it would actually matter. "File it now," she said to Fitch, "as a protective record." before he gets the chance. Fitch nodded approvingly. That's the correct approach, he said, and went to get the necessary forms. They rode back up the mountain in the late afternoon with the certified copies in Gideon's saddlebag and the marriage record in Maeve's coat pocket, and the light was doing what late afternoon light did on the ridge, coming in at a low angle that made every tree throw its shadow long and turned the snow still sitting on the high peaks from white to a pale orange that lasted about 20 minutes before the sun dropped below the western ridge and the color went out of the world. They didn't talk much on the ride up. They didn't need to. This was the thing nobody told you about the people who became necessary to you, that eventually the silence between you stopped being something to fill and started being its own kind of language, carrying things that words would have made smaller. What she thought about, on the ride, was her father. She thought about him more often now than she had in the valley, which was something she hadn't expected. She thought he would have understood this mountain, the work of it, the specific dignity of living by what you could make with your hands and what you could learn with your eyes and your stubbornness. He'd been that kind of man. Not gentle in the soft sense, but gentle in the real one, careful with things that mattered, honest about things that hurt, present in the way that some people never managed to be. She thought he would have liked Gideon. Not immediately. Her father had been suspicious of strangers immediately on principle, but eventually in the way of men who recognize each other. She thought, I wish you could see this. And then she thought, you would have told me I could handle it, and you would have been right, and I would have argued with you, and I would have come around eventually. That was how it had always gone between them. She'd come around eventually, every time, because he was almost always right, and she'd known he was almost always right, but she'd needed to be the one who decided. She'd needed to be the one who decided. She thought that was maybe the real thing, under all of it. Not the mountain or the winter or the wolves or Cade, the fact that for the first time in her life, she had been the one who decided. Dora had made the transaction, yes, but Maeve had decided what it became. She had decided to stay when the work was impossible. She had decided to fix the brace rather than treat it as something that wasn't her business. She had decided to stand her ground in the snow when everything in her wanted to run. She had decided to say yes across a mud yard in thin spring sunlight. She had decided to write Voss at the bottom of a courthouse register. Nobody had given her any of that. Nobody had made it easy or handed it to her or told her she deserved it. She had built it the same way Gideon had built this homestead, out of necessity and stubbornness and the refusal to let the mountain win. And because she had built it, it was actually hers. That was the thing Dora had never understood about her, and probably never would. The things you were given could be taken. The things you built out of yourself were the only things that couldn't. They got back to the homestead in the last of the usable light, put the horses up, came inside. The cabin was cold from the day empty, and Gideon went directly to the fire and built it up while Maeve set the kettle on and hung up her coat and found herself standing in the middle of the room, looking at the place she'd been afraid of in November, and had learned by December and had started calling home somewhere in January without noticing she was doing it. The books on the shelf, the leather kit in its tin box above the door, the scratch marks on the window frame she hadn't removed, 4 scratches she'd made with her thumbnail during the blizzard, still there, small and permanent, the same way the winter was still there in her. Not as damage anymore, but as knowledge. The kind you carried in your hands and your shoulders, and the specific muscle memory of 14 snare lines in all conditions. Tea? She said. Please, Gideon said from the fireplace. She made tea. She brought him a cup and sat in the chair across from him. And they sat with the fire coming up between them and the day settling into the cabin the way days settle when they're finished. Cade's going to be angry, she said. Probably. But he's got nothing to stand on now. Less than nothing, Gideon said. A mislabeled survey marker from 1887 is not a foundation most lawyers want to build a case on. Unless he's got enough money to drag it out anyway, she said. He might. He turned the cup in his hands, but it won't go his way in the end, and men like Cade, they're businessmen first. When the math stops working, they move on to the next property. She thought about Cade on his horse in the yard, doing his arithmetic and finding it short. He'll find another ridge, she said. He will, Gideon said. That's the thing about men like that. There's always another ridge. She looked at the fire. I don't feel sorry for him. Neither do I. I feel sorry for whoever owns the next ridge. She paused. A little. He made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Just a little. The fire said its piece, a shift and a pop, the logs settling into the arrangement that would last the night. Outside, the mountain did what it did, which was mostly be itself without apology, the wind moving through the high timber on the north face in a low, continuous sound that she'd once found alien and had long since stopped hearing as anything other than normal. Gideon reached into his shirt pocket and took out the marriage certificate, the folded copy Hargrove had given them, his version. He looked at it for a moment, then set it on the mantel above the fireplace, flat against the stone, in the same deliberate way he placed things that mattered. She watched him do this and felt something move through her that she couldn't have named at 20 words or 5. It was the feeling of something being placed rather than discarded, of a thing being kept instead of traded away. I want to tell you something, he said, not looking at her, still looking at the certificate on the mantel. She waited. I should have told you before. He turned then and sat back in his chair and looked at her with those old eyes that had seen things packed down in them. When I made the arrangement with your stepmother, I knew what I was doing was wrong. Not illegal, maybe, but wrong. I knew she was... He stopped. I knew she was selling you. I told myself it was mutual benefit, that you'd have shelter and food through winter, that it was better than... He stopped again. Than being there, Maeve said quietly. Yes. He met her eyes. But that wasn't mine to decide. And I want you to know that I know that. I made a decision about your life without your consent, and I've had that sitting with me since the first week. The fire, the mantle, the small certificate against the stone. She thought about what to do with this. With a man giving her the honest version when the comfortable version was right there, and she'd already forgiven him for the version he hadn't admitted to yet. She thought about how easy it would have been for him to never say it, to let what they'd become cover over what it had started as, to trust that she'd moved on and do the same. He hadn't done that. I know, she said. I've known. I know you've known, he said. That's not the same as me saying it. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who fixed things rather than replaced them, who said what he meant slowly and only after he was sure, who had burned furniture alone rather than ask, and had asked eventually anyway, through the roundabout language of an arrangement made in desperation that had turned into something neither of them had planned. It's said, she told him, and I'm keeping the thing it came to anyway. Something released in his face. Not relief exactly, more like a breath being let out after being held longer than you'd realized. That's more than it deserved, he said. Maybe, she said, but it's what I decided. That word again, decided. She said it without thinking and heard it land and saw him hear it and know what she meant by it, which was everything. They sat with the fire for a long time after that, not talking, just being in the same room on the same mountain with the same history behind them and whatever came next in front of them. And it was not a perfect silence, and they were not perfect people, and the homestead around them was not perfect either. The board in the barn floor still needed replacing, the south trail still had ice until June, the north face timber would be a legal question that sat in a courthouse file until a judge in June said it wasn't. And none of that was going to be handed to them or resolved without more work than most people were willing to put in. She was willing. She was, she understood now, the kind of person who was willing. Had always been that person, even when she hadn't known it, even when she'd been running snares in the cold for half rations, and telling herself this was just survival and not the beginning of something. You never knew when something was the beginning of something. You just kept doing the next thing, and one day you looked back and saw the shape of it. The shape of this was a girl traded for flour who had decided, one hard day after another, to become someone no one could trade. She did not think of herself as remarkable. She thought of herself as stubborn, which was both less impressive and more accurate. And she thought of stubbornness as the most useful thing a person could be. Not beautiful or brilliant or fearless, just genuinely unwilling to let the mountain have the last word. She finished her tea. I'm going to check the fire in the barn, she said, standing. I'll come, Gideon said, starting to rise. Stay, she said. Rest the leg. I'll be 10 minutes. He looked at her. That look, the one that still wasn't easy on his face, that meant more because it didn't come easy. 10 minutes, he said. She pulled her coat on and stepped out into the night. The sky was enormous up here. It was always enormous, but sometimes she forgot and then went outside and remembered the full weight of it, the stars dense and indifferent, and so many of them you stopped counting. Just let it be a fact about the universe that you were too small to fully register. She stood for a moment before she walked to the barn, just breathing, just being on the mountain in the night with the cold on her face and the light from the cabin window falling yellow across the snow, and somewhere in the timber on the north face, a night bird calling once and going quiet. She thought about the girl in the wagon on the first day, cold, afraid, watching a house disappear behind her, believing that the worst thing that could happen had just happened. The worst thing that could happen hadn't happened. The worst thing that could happen was to spend your whole life waiting for someone to give you the life you wanted instead of picking up whatever was in front of you and making it. She had picked up an axe, then a snare line, then a needle and thread and a piece of broken leather, then a rifle, then herself. She walked to the barn and checked the horses, settled, breathing slow, warm in the winter-built dark of the space. And she checked the water and the hay and the latch on the door, and she stood for a moment in the barn smell of horse and straw and wood, which was one of the best smells she knew, and she thought, this is mine, not given, built, mine. Then she went back inside out of the enormous sky and into the small specific warmth of a cabin on a mountain, where a man with a bad leg and old eyes and a genuine willingness to say the hard thing was sitting by a fire they both kept burning, and she closed the door behind her and she did not look back. Some doors you close for the last time and you know it, and you don't need to make a ceremony of it. You just close it and you turn to what's in the room and you begin.